An ex-member of the Church of Latter-day Saints is the director of the new Hulu series, taking a dive into the controversial history of the Mormon Church and stirring up the past of an otherwise tight-lipped religion. LA Times staff writer Meredith Blake wrote about Under the Banner of Heaven's attention to authenticity, from the costumes and sets to historical research. Meredith, thank you for giving me the next thing on my list of things to binge.
Thank you. Always happy to help.
All right, give everybody the lay of the land. What's this about?
So, Under the Banner of Heaven is based on John Krakauer's 2003 bestseller, which is a nonfiction book, which takes a look at a 1984 very horrific double murder that took place in sort of the sleepy corner of Utah. A young mother and her infant daughter were brutally murdered. And he uses that as sort of a way in to explore the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints and some of its more violent episodes throughout its past 2 centuries of existence. It was a huge bestseller at the time, kind of controversial, at least if you were a member of the church. A lot of people didn't like the way it portrayed the church or its history, but it did sort of kick off this period, I think, of pop culture interest in the church that we're still sort of living through now. And now it's been adapted into this mini series, which reimagines it as sort of a true crime mystery detective story.
Tell us who's behind it.
So the executive producers are Brian Grazer and Ron Howard. Ron Howard was originally attached to direct it as a feature, and they brought in Dustin Lance Black, the Oscar winning screenwriter of Milk, to adapt it into a feature. That proved a little too difficult because it is such a complicated, sprawling book. So they have made it into a limited series with Dustin Lance Black as showrunner.
And Dustin Lance Black wrote hundreds and hundreds of pages when he kept trying to shape it into a feature film before they decided to, let it run and do it as a limited series. And he has a real personal connection to the material.
He does. He was raised in the church and eventually left as a teenager because of his mother's marriage. And he's written about it and talked about that before. But his mother was in an abusive marriage and felt trapped because of the church and her allegiance to it. So they eventually left. And he is now, he still has many family members in the church. So he still feels, I think, a fondness for at least many of the members. And he told me that when he opened up John Krakauer's book back in 2003 or 2004, when he first read it, even though he'd already left the church, he still felt like it was a transgression of some kind to open up this book because of all the questions it asked about the faith he'd been raised in.
The evidence points to things and to beliefs that I have only ever heard whisperings about.
He talks about how in the church, he felt like you had to leave everything on the shelf. You weren't allowed to ask questions. You weren't allowed to talk about the real history, which was violent at times. They went to great lengths to get the historical details right, from the sets to the actual events in the history of the church.
Yeah, that's something that he emphasized to me was that they felt like if they were going to take this subject on, it was really imperative they get details right. He spent about, a decade working on this project. Much of that time devoted to researching, to reaching out to the family members involved in this case in 1984, the Lafferty family and their survivors, to find out what had happened and to really meet as many people as he could. He met with one of the killers in jail who's still alive in Utah. He met with Brenda Lafferty. She's one of the victims, her surviving family members, and actually uncovered some new information about the last few weeks of her life that he's incorporated into the series. So there was a tremendous amount of work that went into sort of re-reporting not only this case, but reading up on the history of the church and every kind of particular detail you can imagine, down to the pronunciation of certain words to make sure they got it right. Not only for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but for this area of Utah, so every kind of layer of it was accurate.
Right, created sort of a Bible for the cast and crew, sent them all to Utah, wanted them to really absorb it. Let's talk, though, beyond the story of the murder and the
Mm.
old history of the church. There are other big themes that they really wanted to address.
Yeah, so throughout the series, it flashes back to the history of the church and shows these kind of pivotal moments from the history of the church, some of them violent, some of it violence, enacted on members of the church by people who were suspicious of them, who thought they were crazy. Going back to Missouri, there's a famous massacre that took place there. And then the flip side, which is history within the church itself, that they acted out on other people. So it's a complicated look at the origins of this very American religion. This isn't the first time that pop culture has taken a look at the church or its offshoots. We had, of course, the Book of Mormon, which was a huge hit Broadway musical and is still running. We had Sister Wives, which is also still running, and is a look at a more fundamentalist polygamous family. And then, of course, we had Big Love, which ran for quite a long time on HBO, and Dustin Lance Black was actually writer on that. And so, it's a fascination that I think pop culture holds. I think in some ways, Under the Banner of Heaven is perhaps a more thoughtful, respectful look at the church and its origins than any of those really were.
And the dangers of fundamentalism.
Yes, that's something that they also emphasized over and over again, that they tried to draw a distinction between the mainstream church and these sort of more radical offshoot churches, which is something that some of us, that's a distinction that a lot of members of the church are very passionate about us understanding, is that we aren't Sister Wives, we aren't Big Love, we aren't Warren Jeffs, we're your neighbors, and we're not religious zealots. And that is something that I think Black tried to emphasize.
And Meredith, the response from the church?
They have not responded officially to this series. They did in 2003 issue a very vocal condemnation of the book and say that it was a slap in the face of modern day Latter-day Saints and to religion in general. They're very critical. And I think in some ways, maybe they learned that that was just drawing more attention to the book itself. And in this case, they haven't said anything officially.
The show is Under the Banner of Heaven. Meredith, thank you so much.
Thanks again.